Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name is Kritika Adatia and I am the Digital Learning Lead here at ACCA. Our session today is designed to support your preparation for the Advanced Taxation, abbreviated as ATX UK exam. Whether you're taking the paper-based exam or the computer-based exam, you'll find that this webinar will provide you with lots of useful tips and techniques that you can adopt as part of your exam strategy. I'm really pleased to be joined by an expert tax tutor, Roderick Black. Roderick qualified in 1988 with Arthur Andersen before moving on to Ernst & Young to specialise in tax. He became a member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation in 1989, and he has a broad range of professional and commercial experience. He's also an experienced tax lecturer. He has been involved in writing tax exams for ICAS and has also delivered CPD courses on a range of tax subjects, including preparing and delivering in-house courses for the profession and commerce and industry. Now, on that note, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Roderick. So over to you, Roderick, for the rest of the webinar.
That's great. Thanks very much, Kritika, and welcome everyone. Now I'm going to share my screen and go through some slides to begin with, and then we're going to get on to looking at a past exam question from December 1990. So let me just bring these slides up. There we are. So here we are. Okay, so today's agenda. So first of all, we're going to look, what's the examiner looking for in this paper, and challenges students face with ATX, and then at the end, your questions. But we want this to be as practical in terms of the help and advice it gives. So I think the best way of doing this is to spend most of the time looking at a question from the December 2020 paper, and the December 2020 paper, and take you through most of it tutorial style. Okay, but let's just run through these slides to begin with. What's the examiner looking for? Okay, what he's looking for, and all examiners looking for this in all tax papers, in all qualifications, that you know and understand the core technical points of the syllabus, and you can apply them to a real-life scenario. Now, he's only interested in any question, those core technical points that are relevant to the scenario. So one of the things we're going to talk about is brain dumping. If you put down everything you know on the area, you won't get the marks and you'll waste time. So you've got to focus your core technical points that you're writing down as to the ones that are relevant to the scenario. And often he wants a reasoned conclusion. And the key words to look for if he's wanting reasons is explain. He wants you to explain why you're saying what you're saying. There's some ethics aspects, of course, he tests. That's standard stuff. And presentation aspects. Now, that sounds like quite a lot, quite a tall order. But remember, you're not expected to get 100% in the exam. So you only have to get some of the marks in order to pass. And we're going to look at that. Let's look at the challenges with ATX. Okay, here are some of the challenges students typically face. Identifying what the question is about. These are big questions, and when you first see them, they can sometimes seem a bit daunting. They throw you onto the back foot. But let me tell you, every question breaks down into smaller questions, and we're going to show you how that is the case in the particular December 2020 question. Tax as a topic breaks down into smaller questions. And once you've broken it down into more manageable, smaller questions, it is much easier to get the marks. Now, ATX is, in some respects, a tricky paper, and there are some questions where quite a lot of skills are required of you. And again, we're going to show you some of the typical ATX type aspects in this particular question and how to handle them. Okay, we're going to using your technical knowledge to get the marks. We're going to address that, and we're going to show you about presentation marks, and we're going to talk about common mistakes students make, and we've got a wee bit about time management. So let's have a look at some of these. Okay, so getting the presentation marks. Let's get on to that. Okay, now I want to reference here the examiner's reports. The examiner produces reports after every sitting, and it goes through each question and breaks it down, tells you what students did and didn't do well, etc. And also gives very useful advice. So on this, if I just bring up the examiner's report for December 2020, you can find this on the ACCA website. And I've just highlighted here various bits and pieces. I'm just going to move this up. And you can see here, what I've highlighted there is what he's said about the professional skills marks. He's looking for 4 of these. He's looking for these for good presentation and communication skills, clear and easy to follow explanations and calculations, and an organized, well-planned answer. So let's go back to the slide. So good presentation. How do you get a good presentation? The secret is use the question as a template. The examiner will have given you, in the required, he'll have given you the structure of your answer. And I'm going to show you that in the December 2020 question. So use the question to give you the presentation format. Communication skills. Be clear and succinct in the points you make. I think one of the great mistakes students make is they think they have to write lots and lots and lots to get the marks. Essentially, as we'll repeat more than once, a point you make should get a mark. You should try and make every sentence worth a mark. And if there's only 3 or 4 marks for required, it's only 3 or 4 points and 3 or 4 sentences you probably require. So think about writing less, but more focused and relevant to the question that you're being asked, and you'll pick up more marks and save yourself a lot of time. So be clear and succinct in your points. Again, I'm going to try and demonstrate this in the question we look at. Clear and easy to follow calculations and explanations was what he mentioned in the examiner's report. Okay, for calculations, get into the way of using pro formas. Okay, study the pro formas in the examiner's answers to questions. The pro formas you've been talked about, use those. That's the quickest, most efficient, best presentation way to get the marks for that. And for explanations, here's a key tip. Use the word because in your written answers. If you're making a statement which you think is the conclusion and the answer, add the word because afterwards and finish the sentence. That will force you to explain why the statement you've just made is what you've said. Now, you can use as and since, the same kind of meaning words. So because, as, or since. If you use those words after you've made a statement and finish the sentence, you'll be giving the explanations. Just a tip though, don't give explanations if they're not wanted. One of the things the examiner says in his report says, pay attention to the command words in the requirement. Explain this, calculate that. So if he says calculate, that's all you need to do. You don't need to give explanations. Just do the calculations. So look for calculate, look for explain, and answer accordingly. Okay, an organized, well-planned answer. Break things down into smaller component parts of the question and your answer, and leave plenty of space. And if you do that and use the question as a template, you, I think, easily pick up the 4 presentation marks. Okay, common mistakes that students make. Brain dump. What do I mean by that? You see the question is about, say, CFCs, controlled foreign companies, and you just go into automatic pilot and pour everything you know from your studies on that subject down on the answer. We're going to show you an example because of the question we've got. There was a wee bit on CFCs. We're going to show you an example of that. That's just a waste of time. Even if what you say is technically correct, a waste of time. You must only write on CFCs or whatever the topic is, what is relevant to the question as you've been asked it. Okay, so read the required and the question carefully. Spend more time on that and then focus your answer in on what has been asked. Yes, put down the technical points relevant to that, but nothing else. Okay, even if you can, don't put anything else down. Okay, that will save you masses of time and you'll get a lot more marks and you'll be able to get through the exam much more easily. So take time to think about the required and the information you've been given in the question and only answer what's asked about. Make it a mantra. A sentence you write should get you a mark. And then move on. It's a mark accumulation exercise passing these exams, and it's a series of points, and each one should get you a mark. Another thing students do, which they shouldn't do, is repeating facts on the question. It's a complete waste of time. Even if you use a copy and paste function within the platform, it's a complete waste of time. Okay, you don't need to set the scene, you don't need to give an introduction, you don't need to tell the examiner what you're going to do, you just get on and answer the question. Okay, again, he said that in his examiner's reports. Poor layout and presentation, well, we've talked about that. Use the question required as a template and use pro formas. Now, calculation errors, we're all going to make calculation errors. You're working under pressure here, but just maybe try and slow it down a wee bit. And if you're not writing masses and masses of irrelevant stuff, you'll have more time. So slow it down maybe just a wee bit and just do a reasonableness check after your calculation and say, does that sort of look a reasonable number, or does it look absolutely ridiculous? Okay. Now, time management, there's a separate article on time management from the examiner on the website. Okay, and I would refer you to that. Okay, but these are the key points of what he's said. Read the required first. Be clear what you have to do. He'll have taken ages writing that required to make sure it's absolutely clear to the students that this is what I require of them and nothing else. Allocate time. So if you leave aside the sort of reading time to scope the paper out at the beginning of 15 minutes, you've got 1.8 minutes a mark. So if you've got 3 marks in a section of a question, that's about 5 minutes. After that, aim to make 3 or 4 points. There's usually more available marks than the 3, so there might be 4 available marks, say. Make 4 points, move on. 4 separate points, move on. Okay, so stick to that. That will get you through the exam. Let this be your mantra. Keep moving through the exam. Keep moving through the exam. If you get bogged down on something, stop writing, move on. Say to yourself, do you know what? I'll come back to this at the end of the exam. Even if you don't have time to do that, it gets you to move on and scoop up easier marks later on. Practice a lot on the ACCA Practice Platform. Okay, that will help get you familiar with the technology you're using. And assume it's 1 mark for each technical point made. As I say, there's probably more likely available marks, but if you make 4 points in a 3-mark question, I would do that. I would say that's enough, then move on. Don't worry about underlining, making bold. Obviously, in the real world, you'd like your reports to look all neat and tidy. Don't worry about that. You're not going to lose presentation marks if you don't do that. And just note, there's rarely any presentation marks given for any spreadsheet calculations you do. So don't worry about presentation marks specifically there. Try and make it neat and tidy, and leave plenty of space, leave plenty of lines, but don't worry too much about presentation marks on that. Okay, again on time management, practice writing less. Okay, the best answers actually are probably the briefest and most succinct, but focused on what was required and in the scenario. Make what you write count, make each point count. Okay, so that's why we say don't just pour everything down as a brain dump that you know, and don't just copy stuff from the answers. Okay, if you're writing down in your sentences and your points stuff that is technically correct and relevant to what was asked, you'll be picking up marks. If you write down stuff that is technically correct and irrelevant to what was asked, you won't. And if you write down stuff that's technically incorrect, obviously you won't. Now, everyone's going to make mistakes. That's accepted. You don't have to get 100%, remember. Okay, so let's look at a question and put some of this into practice. I've just whipped through all those slides quite quickly because I really want to get on to looking at a question. And I'm taking question 1 from the December 2020 paper. And my aim is to show you, give you practical help as to how to put what we've just been talking about into practice. I've also included, just for completeness, an example in a bit of it of what not to do. And hopefully when you read it, you'll think, that looks really good. But actually, I'll explain, wouldn't get you any marks. It's correct, but it wouldn't get you any marks. And we'll come to that. So December 2020 paper, and I'm going to go to the platform to bring this up. Okay, so here I have it here. Okay, so let me just close this down. So there is what you see on the December 2020's question 1. So your manager has received an email from Lamar. He's the managing director and major shareholder in this company, rep, and he and Lamar, he and the company are clients of your firm. Your manager has forwarded the email to you together with an email detailing the work you're required to do. You've got 2 exhibits, an email from Lamar and an email from your manager. Okay, and the first thing to do is to look at the requirements. Okay, always look at the requirements first. Why? Because they give you a heads up as to what the question is about. So when you get into reading the facts of the question, you can see their tax significance, and therefore you're ahead of the game. Okay, so always read the required first. So what you have to do here is prepare meeting notes. Okay, so pick up on that, meeting notes, and you're going to top in your answer, particularly with a little bit of a heading to help get presentation marks, to make it clear that these are meeting notes. I'll show you this in the answer. Okay, and the following marks are available. Now note how it's broken down. A, B. B is broken down into 3 parts, 1, 2, and 3, and then C, and then D. Okay, now note the time allocate, the mark allocation. Let me tell you, when the examiner puts that there, he is really trying to be helpful to you. He's trying to say 5 marks, 1.8 minutes a mark, spend no more than 9 minutes on that. Okay, and after that, move on. If you've really trouble doing that, say to yourself, do you know what, I'll come back and finish this later. That will probably be the 12th of never, and you won't get back to it because time pressure is against you, but it gets you to move on. Okay, so what I'm going to say first of all is those headings are the structure of your answer. We've been talking about presentation marks. Those headings are the structure of your answer. So you can use those to lay out the skeleton of your answer, and then you can fill in your answer within each bit. Okay. Now, very often in exams, and this is the nature of tax as a subject, it breaks down into more self-contained parts. So in this bit, this question, part 1 is actually the ethics part. I'm not actually going to go over that bit because I want to focus more on part B particularly. Part 1 is the ethics part. Part B is broken down into 3 parts, and although you don't know it yet, 1 is actually quite the trickiest part of this. There's 9 marks. 2 and 3 are relatively self-contained questions, but all within part B. Now C is a completely separate question. It's like a little mini question, okay, on its own. So is D, okay? And so if they were presented to you as little mini questions, you'd automatically think the exam question was much easier than when it's thrown at you as one big question. So that's the way to break it down as you do it, and see it as smaller mini questions. And also it means that the damage in terms of marks lost if you don't do well on a bit of one of those questions, say the purchase of investment property, is 5 marks. You'll get some of them, no doubt, but it's self-contained, and the damage if you don't do that well in a particular area, because you can go on and get marks in the other areas. They're relatively self-contained. Okay, so that's the required. You should always start with that. And then we've got 2 email extracts. Okay, and there's one there, which is, let me bring this up a bit bigger. Okay. That's from your manager, and there's the first one, and this is the fact of this question. Okay, now I'm not going to use these on the platform, because what I'm going to go, I'll come back to the platform and the answer, but what I'm going to go to first of all is a program I've got here called PDF Annotator. The advantage of this is it allows me to write on the screen. So I'm going to put this right up on the screen, and then I can take you through it and show you how to break it down. Okay, so this is from the client. Okay, that's from the client there. And so let me just bring this up here. I've also got the original required that we were just looking at there. Okay, I've got them there. Okay. So as I say, those headings would be the answer. And then what we've also got, and I know we're jumping about a bit, but let me just, there's the information, further information from your manager. Now, this in here is going to be other aspects of things, other things you need to do, okay? But let's just, and again, actually, before we get into the information of the client, let me just highlight some of this to show you. Note that these headings are the same as the headings in the required. So knowledge obtained from advising other clients, investment in J, okay? And remember, if you remember, the second bit was broken down into 3 parts, Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3, okay? And then it moved on to purchase of investment property. This was the required. And then it moved on to the gift of the shares. Okay, so this is more detailed information and aspects of what you've got to do in the information from your manager. Okay, please prepare notes for use at a meeting with Lamar. I want you to lead the meeting. You should therefore set out the notes in a manner which will make it easy for you to refer to them during the meeting. Those headings are your structures, just the same as they were, are your structure of your answer, just as the same as they were in your in the required that we looked at. Okay. So let me go to the information first of all. Okay. So this is what the client's telling you. Okay. So let's just go through it. So they're in discussion with the management of CRO Limited regarding the establishment of a new company, J. If it proceeds, J will commence trading on 1 April 2021, carry on its business activities in the country of Garia and manufacture computer components. So it's going to be a company that carries on business overseas. It's proposed that REP will own 30% of the shares, with CRO Limited owning the other 70%. However, we regard this potential investment as somewhat risky, such that if we decide to proceed, we may prefer to own just 20% rather than 30%. Okay, now this is you're into the most difficult part of the question here. Let me just highlight this. You've got a proposal that your client would own 30%, and the other company 70%, or it might be you own 20% of J and the other company owns 30%. So there's alternatives you need to consider. So we need to, I'm just going to note this in here, we need to address the issues if we own 30% or 20%. Okay, so that's a key piece of information to pick up. Then it says J is expected to be profitable in the year end 31 March 22. However, it's a possibility it will be loss making. Okay, so we need to address what's the position if it's profitable and if it's loss making. Okay, now just to highlight this, this is the most difficult part of the question. Okay, so this is not easy, but I'm trying to show you a way to break it down and get marks out of it. Tells you the tax adjusted profit is budgeted to be 135, all of which will relate to its activities in Garia, will have no other source of income. So it's going to have an activity in Garia. It says, we've not been involved in a joint venture like this before, and we would appreciate your advice on the following three extracts from the documentation provided. It's not been determined whether J will be UK resident or not resident. Okay, the UK resident or resident in Garia. So we need to address that. So at the moment we may have 30% or we may have 20%. It may be profitable, it may be loss making. It may be resident in the UK, it may be in Garia. But this is the most difficult part of this question. And this is why this is to do with the residency of J, for which there were 9 marks. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to break this down and address it chunk by chunk. Okay, now you'd be doing extremely well if you got everything right on this here. This is the most difficult part of the question, but anyone should be able to eke out a certain minimum number of marks, which will certainly keep you in the game here. Okay, so secondly, if J is resident in the UK, will consider making an election to exempt its overseas trading profits. Okay, and that is the second part of the required. And the third one is, we've been advised if J is resident in Garia, this will not result in a charge under the Controlled Foreign Company CFC rules. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and go back to the other information we've got, because what comes next, the purchase of investment property and the post-gift of shares to the trust, they are self-contained areas. Okay, so I want to focus on the most difficult bit first. So let's go to the other bit we've got. So that was the client information. And now we're going back to what Lamar's said. Okay, A is to do with ethics, using information from that you've gleaned from other clients. I'm going to park this. I'm not covering that in this webinar. Let's go to the investment in J. So REP and CRO are UK resident companies. So one's going to have 20 or 30%, the other the balance. Business profits are subject to 13% local tax, and there's no double tax treaty. Okay. Residency of J. We want explanations of the relevance of the country of residence of J in relation to the amount of corporation tax payable in the UK and Gary in respect of its profits, and the relief available if J's business in Gary were to make a trading loss. Before you start, take some time to identify the different possibilities which need to be addressed, recognising that we do not yet know what percentage of J will be owned by Rep Limited. Okay, so we need to say it might be 20%, it might be 30%, it might be profitable, it might be loss-making. What's the position in the UK? What's the position in Gary? So that is all complicated stuff to get one's head round, but we need to break it down and have a structure to fill in the different parts of our answer. Okay, and then the second and third part is election to exempt the profits of J Limited's overseas permanent establishment. List the implications of J making this election. That's a self-contained piece of the paper. It's just saying if J Limited had an overseas permanent establishment in Gary and it made the election to exempt the profits, list the implications. So that's relatively self-contained. That's more straightforward marks. And then the third point is controlled foreign company rules. I can confirm that a CFC charge will not arise if J is resident in Gary. However, I want to provide Lamar with an explanation of the purpose of the CFC rules and the charge which can be levied under them. So there's two things that you've got to address. Now, I won't put it up again, but if we looked at the required, the controlled foreign company bit was 3 marks for that, and it was 3 marks for that. Okay, and this bit up here was 9 marks. Okay, so just to deal with second and third bit first, that means you're looking to make 3 or 4 points on each of those Roman numerals 2 and 3 parts. But the top bit is much more tricky because you've got a 20 or 30% shareholding to consider, you've got profitable or loss-making to consider, and it's just a more tricky part and more marks for it. Okay, but these are relatively self-contained parts. So break the question down. Use these headings as your template of your answer. Okay, we'll come back to purchase of investment property and the gift of the shares to the extent we have time in this webinar. Okay. So let me now go to the back to the software. Okay. And I'm going to close this down for the moment. That was the required. And I'm going to bring up the word processor part of it. Okay, now I've prepared some of the answer here. And so let's have a look at it. Okay, so first off, notes for meeting with, I've headed this up, remember it's notes for a meeting. So in order to get the presentation marks, you want to get a good structure and head it up sensibly as notes for a meeting with Lamar. The client is Rep Limited and Lamar, prepared by Tax Senior, and put a date in. Okay, so that's, you've topped it. There's no tail to this. It's not a letter. So just put something up at the beginning and then get into your answer. And what I've said is take this as the structure of your answer, the required. So I've just copied this, knowledge obtained from advising other clients. So that's the ethics part, which we're not going to have time to do in this webinar. Then move on to B, investment in J. Divide it up into residency, election to exempt the overseas profits of J, and never mind what I've written there for the moment, and then down CFC rules. I'm going to go back to the detailed answer I put in there. Okay, then you move on, I'm going to skip past this, to purchase of investment property and proposed gifts of the shares. Now, when you get into the last part, it's one to do on the word processor function because it's a calculation. So get the skeleton of your answer set up, and then you can insert the bits bit by bit. Now, you've already broken it down into the component parts. In fact, most of these tax questions, although they look daunting to begin with because you've got a whole lot of stuff to do for your 35 marks or whatever, all tax questions and all tax problems actually in the real world break down into smaller chunks. And once you see that and set up your answer to fill in these smaller chunks, it becomes much more manageable. And even if you didn't get all of it finished the way you'd like, you'll have accumulated marks across the question and across the paper. And this is, passing this paper is an exercise in accumulating sufficient number of marks. It's not an exercise in getting it all correct. Okay, and that's what you must remember. So you need to keep moving through the exam. Okay, so that's the way I would set up your answer. And then I would go to, let's do the first bit, the investment in J, and the three subparts: residency, the election to exempt the overseas profits, and the CFC rules. Now let me go down to the bottom. Now this is the most tricky part, okay? So I've just put this separately just to keep it clearer for you. I would have this in the body of the answer I just put up above. So you have a heading saying J Limited, let's assume it's UK resident. And within that heading, you say, let's write something about if it's UK resident and makes profits, because we know that's one scenario we've been presented with. It might be profitable, it might be loss-making. And it might be UK resident and it might be not UK resident. So let's say we'll put up a heading, J Limited, profitable, and we'll write something about the implications if it's profitable. And then we'll say, well, what if it was loss-making? We'll write something if J is UK resident and loss-making. And then we'll say, what difference does it make whether we have 20 or 30% shareholding? So we've broken it down into J is UK resident, and then J is not UK resident. And within each of J is UK resident, we're going to have profitable, loss-making, and let's think about the difference of having 20 or 30%. And then we're going to the non-resident bit, and we're going to do the same thing. J is not UK resident. What's the analysis if it's profitable? What's the analysis if it's loss-making? What difference does it make if the parent company has 20 or 30% shareholding? Now, if you see there, remember there's 9 marks for this area. We divide it into 2 sections. J is UK resident, profitable, loss-making, effective 30%, 20%, 30%. So we've got 2 sections, UK resident, not resident, and we've got 3 subsections. Okay, now if you think of it that way, and there's 9 marks, and every sentence probably is going to be worth a mark, and you've got something to say under each of those, then you hopefully will get at least a mark out of each of those. It could be easily 6 marks and probably more. That's the way to break it down. And let me say, this is a difficult part of the question. You know, for the examiner to throw to you, well, we're setting up a company, might be UK resident, might not, might be profitable, might not, we might have 20%, we might have 30%. That's a lot of facets, a lot of permutations to think about. Just put down the facets and try and write something sensible on the scenario you've been given on each of those, okay? And you'll be picking up marks. So break it down and pick out the aspects. And the key thing is you've to identify is, could be resident, might not. So resident, non-resident, profitable, loss-making, 20% or 30%. And if you see something on each of those that's relevant and correct, you'll get a lot of the marks, if not all of them. So now what I'm going to do now is, because I'm going to switch to a different program I've got, so I can, this program here where I've produced the answer. So I haven't produced this on the software because I wanted to use color and add in things to make the point. But what I've got here, just to show you, is the exact same structure I had before. So there's J as UK resident, there's profitable, loss-making, and the effect of 20 or 30% shares. These are my subheadings. And not UK resident. I'm going to go through this, so don't worry, but I'm flipping through the detail. Profitable, loss-making, and effect of 20% or 30%. So now I'm going to write in something. And remember, this is only 9 marks for this, so if I want to write something under each of these headings, it's probably going to be not a huge amount. I've written what would get you the full 9 marks. Okay, that's a tall order, and you're not expecting yourself to get the full 9 marks. It'd be great if you did, but you're not expecting that. So this is really an all singing, all dancing full answer. Okay, so let's go through it. So profitable. And don't be afraid to say stuff that is really basic, so long as it's technically correct and it's relevant to the scenario. It wants to see if you can know the technical points and can you apply them to a scenario. So what I've said is J will be taxed on its worldwide income because it's a UK resident company. This is the section where I'm assuming it's UK resident. UK resident company, UK resident individual, they're taxed on their worldwide income and gains. And I've said J will be taxed on its worldwide income because, look at the word because. Okay, so I'm explaining the statement I just made, because it's a UK resident company. And if you thought of it, the permanent establishment is not a separate legal entity. Permanent establishment is just like the branch that J, the legal person, is running overseas. So there I've considered the UK perspective. you could flip and consider the perspective in Garia. The profits will also be taxed in Garia at 30% because there's Garia source profits. Okay, there's two ways we tax in this country, and most jurisdictions follow the same. If you're resident here, you're generally taxed on everything you make, no matter where it arises. And if you're not resident here, you're only taxed on the source here. So you can assume that is the case in Garia. So Garia, if this company is UK resident, will only tax the profits of the PE. Now, the PE is the branch that they've got overseas, is all they've got. So Garia will tax and the UK will tax. That's double taxation. Now, there's no double tax treaty, so we'd rely on UK's unilateral tax rules, where we, on our side, give double tax relief. So full UK DTR will be available as a deduction against J's UK CT bill for the 13% Garia tax, as it's less than the net. There's the word as. See the word as? That's an explanation. Why is the full deduction available of 13% against the UK tax? Because it's less than the UK tax on that source. So that's a wee bit of planning I've put in there. Here's my conclusion. So in the UK, we'd pay another extra 6% corporation tax. Get 19%, but we get credit for the 13% Garia tax. So they pay 13% in Garia and the extra 6% here after double tax relief. That's a conclusion. Now, you could do a calculation there, but that's a very full, complete answer. You've considered it's UK resident profitable from the UK perspective, the Garia perspective, and you pulled it together as a conclusion. Okay, let's move on to what if it's loss-making. So if it's UK resident and loss-making, there'll be no tax to pay, or in Garia or the UK, because there's no profits. Don't be afraid to say really basic stuff like that. It is correct. There's no tax to pay if you're making losses. What about loss relief in the UK? Okay, well, J, if it's a UK resident company, could carry that loss forward against future profits, including any chargeable gains. Now, what about group relief? Well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but there's no proposal that REP will own 75% of the shares in J, so you can say for sure group relief isn't available. But what about consortium relief? Well, that's the next point when we're looking at the UK company REP's 20% or 30% shareholding. Okay, now, if you can, it's good to get a brief technical theory explanation down. So here I've given an example of this. Consortium relief is available where 75% of J's shares are held by corporate shareholders only looking at 5% plus shareholders. If one company owns 75%, then that company can claim all J's losses as group relief. Okay, so then we apply that to the facts. If REP owns 30%, and the other UK company CRO owns 70%, yes, that's consortium relief situation, and it could get 30% relief. REP could get relief for 30% of J's losses. If it owns 20%, the other company must own 80%, and that's more than 75%, so they'll get relief through group relief of all the losses. Okay, now, what I'm trying to demonstrate is here, and I'm not saying this is easy stuff, I think this is quite difficult, this stuff. Trying to demonstrate is you're not writing a huge amount. You're not pouring everything down on all the technical theory. You're focusing it in on what the question is about, the facts of the question. Okay, let's move on. What if this overseas company, J, is not UK resident? Well, if it's not resident and profitable, and incidentally, you could copy the wording you've just put in, you could copy the wording you just put in above section, copy it in here, and then just change it as is fit for the scenario of it being not UK resident. That saves you some typing. Okay, so if J is not UK resident, it will not be taxed on any of the profits because it's not resident here and it's got no UK source income. Okay, easy mark. Okay, so we're considering the UK perspective there. What about in Garia? Well, Garia, it will tax it at 13% because they're Garia source profits. Again, consider the Garia perspective. Consider both UK and Garia if you can. What about loss making? There's no loss relief. For a non-UK resident company, the shareholding companies can't get loss relief. It's a non-resident company. You can only get consortium relief or group relief in respect of shareholdings in UK resident companies. And then over the page, effective 20% or shareholding rather than 30%. Well, actually, there's not really anything to say here. But if you thought of this, I've put in this point, which is arguably beyond the scope of this part of the question. If you thought of it, definitely put it in. I'm sure you'd get the credit in terms of a mark. If REP has less than 25% of the shares, there can't be any CFC charge. Now, later on, it tells you they're not bothered about there being a CFC charge. But it is correct to say if they have less than 25% of the shares, there can't be a CFC charge at all, whereas there could, in theory, be one if they had more than 30%. But arguably, that's a wee bit beyond the scope of the question. Any other points you can think of? Well, if any paid dividends are paid out by J to Rep, they'll be exempt from corporation tax. But that last bit on the screen there is really me showing off a bit, to be honest. I wouldn't expect many students to get those points. But if they cross your mind, put them down. If they're relevant to the scenario and technically correct, definitely put them down. Okay, so that would easily get you all 9 marks. And I'm not saying that that is easily achieved by students in this. I think this is a difficult part of the question. Okay, this is a difficult part of the question because you've got to consider UK resident, not UK resident, profitable, loss-making, 20% shareholding, 30% shareholding. That's a lot of facets, a lot of dimensions to have to consider. But the way to approach it, which is really what I'm trying to give you, techniques, realistic techniques, is set out the headings of the different points, resident, not resident, and within those, profitable, loss-making, 20 or 30% shareholding, and write something technically correct and relevant. Don't pour your heart out with everything you know about tax into question. Focus it in. You can see if you've broken it up like that, you've got sort of 6 sections, and it's probably a mark or 2 you might expect in each one, maybe a bit more in some. And you'll scoop up quite a bit of marks from what is a very difficult part of the question. Okay, so that's hopefully helpful in giving you practical techniques. Let me go back to the required. Okay, so the second part is, that was the first part, 9 marks. Second part is election to exempt the profits of J Limited's overseas permanent establishment from UK tax. And it says, list the implications of J making this election. Okay, now 3 marks. So 3 marks, think 3, ideally 4 points if I can. But after that, move on. So if you're reasonably confident you've made 3 or 4 good points, move on. But definitely look to make 3 or 4 good points. Now I'm going back to the actual software because here I've put in the second part. So there it is there. Second, election to exempt overseas PE profits of J. Think a mark for each sentence I make, a mark for each point. Okay, so what I've said here is a UK resident company with overseas PEs can make this election. The election exempts the PE profits from UK CT, but it means there's no relief in the UK for any losses. Generally, it's a symmetrical treatment. If we're exempting a positive amount, like a profit from tax, we don't give relief for losses. There is still 13% tax in Garia on the profits. Okay, that's bringing in, so what I've said at the first 2 points is just pure theory. I'm now trying to apply and bring in the scenario, the question. So I'm talking about the Garia. So there's still 13% in Garia on profits because the PE exemption is a UK PE exemption from UK tax. We can't do anything about their 13% tax rate. That's up to them. So we'll still pay 13% tax in Garia on the profits. What I put in block capitals there in the brackets is not what you'd write in your answer. That's my sort of asides to you. And therefore, so the overall UK tax saving from the exemption is 6%, because if you didn't have the exemption, you pay 19% in the UK, but you get credit for the foreign Garia tax of 13%, leaving you with 6% to pay in the UK. If you make the exemption, you'll pay nothing in the UK, but you'll still pay 13% in Garia. So it's either don't make the exemption, it's 13% in Garia and 6% extra in the UK after double tax relief. Make the election, it's 13% in Garia. The difference is 66%. So you save yourself the 6% extra UK tax after taking off the double tax relief. If it was a UK resident company, you save yourself that if you go for the PE exemption. Okay. The election is irrevocable. That's important to note because once you make it, you can't change your mind, and it will apply to all the permanent establishments J has now and in the future. Now, in that, I've made said 6 different things, 6 different sentences. Okay. That is a way over the top, overkill answer. I'm just doing it for completeness. Any 3 of those points would get the marks. So look how little you have to write. I think one of the failing students who really get time pressured and suffer in this exam from is they think writing more is making progress. You want your points to count, so they have to be technically correct and relevant to the scenario and relevant to the question. Don't just pour down everything. Don't brain dump, okay? If you'd made 3 of those points, you'd have got full marks. Ideally, you don't want to make 4 because there's probably an extra mark available in case one of yours isn't right. But you've tied it in to the question. You've given a bit of tax theory and you've also tied it into the question. Okay. Now, let me go back to the question and pick up the CFC point. So this was 3 marks. I can confirm that a CFC charge will not arise if J Limited is resident in Garia. However, I want to provide Lamar with an explanation of the purpose of the CFC rules and the charge which can be levied under them. So those are the 2 things you need to write about, and that's all. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to software and I'm going to show you, first of all, here's an example of how not to do it. Now, I think when you read this, I think it reads very well. I think it's quite impressive. And if you were writing this down in the exam, you might think, this is great. I'm really doing well. I know my stuff on this. I'm making great progress. Let's see how many marks you'd get. So let's just read through what I've written. This is an example of how not to do it. Rep Limited and CRO Limited have been discussing setting up a new subsidiary in Garia where it will trade, but it won't have any other income or chargeable gains and it might be loss-making. This company could be UK resident or not UK resident. If it's UK resident, there will be a PE in Garia. It might exempt profits by election. There won't be a charge under the CFC rules, so Rep's been advised. Okay, all of that just repeats the question. There's nothing wrong with it in the sense it's correct, but it adds 0 in terms of marks. It's all a waste of time, okay? It repeats the question and adds nothing. Okay, remember this is meeting notes, okay? And so it's points you're going to use in your meeting with a client. So you don't need to have down in your meeting notes all that kind of stuff. And certainly in the answer, you don't need that. For 3 marks, you're making 3 or 4 points, okay? A CFC is a foreign company. That's actually not precise enough. The key issue is it's a non-resident company. A CFC is a foreign company controlled by UK corporate shareholders. Actually, strictly, it's by UK persons. Could be individuals involved. Okay, so CFC is a foreign company controlled by UK corporate shareholders. I'm giving you an example of something that is sort of getting there, but is not quite precise enough. There are a number of exemptions, and here I've listed all the exemptions: exempt period, excluded territories, low profits, low profit margin, tax exemption, and you could even write about all of those. Okay, takes even more time. And then applying that to the facts, given the level of projected profits, 135,000, it's likely that J will be exempt, so the CFC rules won't apply. You weren't asked about the exemptions, so all of that you wrote down, it could be completely technically correct. It's not relevant to what you were required to do. Okay, what you were asked about was the purpose of the CFC charge and the charge which can be levied under the CFC rules. Let me just go back to that just to reinforce that. Okay, you were asked for, there it is, an explanation of the purpose of the CFC rules and the charge which can be levied under them. Okay, so you need to really pick up on that when you're reading the question carefully and only write about that. Okay, so if you do that, you'll get the 3 marks. All the other stuff I wrote, it's all good stuff, you couldn't object to it in a kind of general sense. The point is, however, you've only got 3 marks, and that's about 5 minutes. This is why students overrun. If they wrote all of that I've just been through, you never do that. I couldn't do that in 5 minutes, go into all of the exclusions and exemptions, I should say, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so all of what I've written above, and you could flesh it out with more detail on the exemptions, I think you would get 0 marks because it doesn't address what you were asked. So let's look at a better answer, okay? So here's a better answer that would get you the full 3 marks. As noted above, if J were non-resident, it would suffer no UKCT as it only has Garia overseas income. The purpose of the CFC rules, now you see I put that in bold there. A good way to keep yourself on track is look at the question, and it said it wanted to know about the purpose of the CFC rules. So actually write that down, the purpose of the CFC rules, repeat the requirement of the question, and then finish the sentence. Is to prevent UK companies or groups from avoiding tax by setting up a non-resident company and diverting what would be UK profits into it, so they're only taxed overseas and not taxed in the UK, maybe at a nil or low rate of charge. That's an explanation of the purpose of the CFC rules, which is what you were asked for. And then the other thing it asks for, the CFC tax charge that is levied. It's levied on UK corporate shareholders with 25% or above shareholdings. The UK shareholding companies share, pro rata the shareholding of the diverted profits, the profits that were diverted out of the UK, is taxed on that shareholder at 19% by adding it to their CT liability. The UK company can reduce this by double tax relief for overseas tax relating to those profits. Okay, now that is, again, a fool would get all the marks. Okay, you might not have written as much of that. You might have not talked about DTR. Fair enough. You might have been a little bit more imprecise in the way you worded things. Fair enough. But you're going to be getting some of those 3 marks. Okay, so that is a very full answer that would get all 3 marks. But in particular, you want to make sure you address the purpose of the CFC rules and the CFC tax charge that's levied. And you pick that up from the exhibit where it spelled it out. That was exactly what you were being asked for. Okay, so that's the first part. Now let's go back to the question, and because we've got other parts here, the purchase of the investment property. Okay, so let's go back to that, and we get this from the, I shall go back to my spreadsheet here. Let's make the easier way to do it. So if we go back to, so this is purchase of investment properties. So this is the next bit. This was worth 5 marks. We're considering the purchase by REP Limited of a new unused commercial building for £200,000 plus 20% value added tax. REP would then grant a 20-year lease of this building to a retailer. Will REP be able to cover the VAT charged by the vendor on the sale of this building? Okay, so they're buying a building and then they're going to rent it out. They'll pay input VAT when they buy the building. Can they get that back? Okay, so they're going to rent the building out. If I also go to the other exhibit, explain the matters which Lamar should be aware of in relation to REP Limited recovering the value-added tax which would be incurred on the purchase of the investment property. There is no need to consider partial exemption or the capital goods scheme. So whatever you do, even if you know about it, don't talk about that. Complete waste of marks. Even if you're technically correct, you'll get nothing. Okay, so you need to address the matters that the client should be. The matters that the client should be aware of in recovering the value-added tax on the purchase of the property. Okay, so let's go and have a look at my solution on this. Now, remember, this is 5 marks. Well, you might not remember, but this is 5 marks. So let's go to the word processor bit. Purchase of investment property. Okay, so you want to be making about 5 separate points. If you can make 6, good and well, because there's often an extra mark beyond the 5 that, in this example, it's specified in the marking guide. Okay, so what I'm saying here is the VAT on the new property, so what REP pays, will be recoverable if REP makes a taxable supply of the building. Okay, that's a statement of technical fact, if you like, technically correct point. The VAT on the new property will be recoverable if REP makes a taxable supply of the building. Then we're applying it to the scenario. Letting, which is what they're planning to do, is an exempt supply unless the option to tax has been made by REP, when it will become a standard rated taxable supply. So REP should opt to tax. To get the input VAT back on when they bought the building, they need to opt to tax. Okay, then I'm applying that to the actual facts of the question. It will recover the £40,000 VAT on purchase, but it will have to add 20% VAT to the tenant on the rent, and also when it sells the building. The tenant will not mind this. I'm considering the tenant's point of view. That wasn't obvious, I think, from the required that you'd have to do that. Don't worry about that. The tenant will not mind this if they're a taxable business, because what they pay as input tax to you on the rent, they'll be able to recover if they're using the building in their VAT taxable business. Okay, so they'll recover that VAT if they're a taxable business. Okay, now I think when you read this question, it wasn't obvious, I think, it wouldn't be obvious to a lot of students that you have to consider the position of the tenant. But that doesn't matter because there's 5 marks and you'll be able to get quite a few of them just by saying the first 4 lines. You get 4 of those 5 marks. I think if you said the VAT on the new property will be recoverable if REP makes a taxable supply of the building. Letting is an exempt supply unless the option to tax has been made by REP when it becomes a standard rated taxable supply. So REP should opt to tax. We'll recover 40,000, but have to add 20%. If you said that, that's about as simple and basic as you can say in technical theory applied to facts, and you'd get 4 of the 5 marks. Okay, so I think that is a good example of how you can pick up quite a few marks. And even if you didn't think of the 10th side of thing, you're doing very well. Okay, so that's the purchase of the investment property. Let's move on to the last section, the proposed gift of shares. Now, we didn't look at this in the question, so let's go and do that. Okay, let's go and look at this in the question. Okay, so I established a discretionary trust for the benefit of my nieces, and I'll put this up full screen, for the benefit of my nieces and nephews on 1st of August 2010. On 1 November 2020, I'm planning to give 20,000 of my shares in REP to this trust. After I've made the gift, I will still own 60,000 shares. So that was 80% before. So 60,000, it's 80,000 shares before, give away 20 leaves you with 60. So if 60,000 is 60%, then 80,000 must be. So go down from 80% to 60%. They're not relevant business property, so no BPR, because it's an investment company. I'm aware that the gift on 1 November 2020 may result in an inheritance tax liability. If I decide to make the gift, I will pay any tax due. Okay, so what that means is the rate of tax IHT will be 25%, not 20%. Okay, 20% of the trustees paid it, 25% if he pays it. So if you gift an asset, give away an asset into a discretionary trust in lifetime, that is what's called a chargeable lifetime transfer. There will be IHT to pay. If you could get 100% BPR, there wouldn't be any IHT to pay, but that's been ruled out because this is not relevant business property. So there's going to be a tax charge here. I've made the following gifts in the past, and he gives you the dates. Now we're looking particularly for gifts that have been made in the 7 years before this one, which was 1 November 2020. Okay, and you can see that the first one is more than 7 years. 1 August 2010 is more than 7 years. Okay, so it was a CLT, chargeable lifetime transfer, but it was more than 7 years before this gift. Cash to the brother on 1 February 2016, that would be a pet, so no tax charge on that unless he dies within 7 years. We're not talking about death here, this is a lifetime gift, no tax charge on that. But that would use up, and this is what some of the marks were for, and that would use up the annual exemption for 15-16 and then 14-15. Okay. Additional cash to trustees, well, that would have been a CLT, and that's within the last 7 years. Okay. That's within the last 7 years, and that would get the annual exemption. It was May 16, so that would get the 16-17 annual exemption. Now note that you can't get the 15-16 annual exemption because you already had it against the previous year's gift. Okay, and then in July 2020, which is the year we're in, we're looking at November 2020, putting stuff into the trust. In July 2020, we put in cash, he gave cash to the sister, that's a pet, and it will use up the 2021 annual exemption. So quite a bit of the marks for this were in showing the right usage of annual exemptions. Now, if you didn't get that, you could still get a reasonable chunk of marks out of this, as we'll show you. Okay, now when we go to the other, we have to take these exhibits together. We go to the other exhibit. There we have it. Okay, calculation of the inheritance tax, which would be payable by Lamar if he were to give 20,000 shares in REP to go from 80,000 down to 60,000 on 1 November as planned. Your calculation should indicate the availability or otherwise of all relevant annual exemptions. Okay, now, I think that was a more tricky part of it, but essentially the first gift in a tax year gets that annual exemption, and the preceding annual exemption from the preceding year if it hasn't already been used. And so that was why I was putting the annual exemptions in. Now, we were at 80%, and we're going down to 60%, so those are the two share values to use. The other share values aren't relevant from an IHT point of view. Okay? And because the other individuals have no connection with Lamar, there can be no issue of related property, maybe if his spouse owns shares. So we're just going to say, what's the transfer of value using £24 on the shareholding he had before and £17 on the shareholding he had after. Okay? And we have to remember that he made a transfer that was chargeable within the preceding 7 years. Okay? But even if you struggled a bit with that aspect of it, I'm going back to the software to show you in the spreadsheet. I'm going back to show you the calculations. Let me get this up full screen. Even if you struggled with the what happened in the preceding 7 years, you could still do reasonably well in this. I've put in explanatory notes in the marks. You wouldn't be required to put in the explanatory notes. I've just put them in here, okay? So I've done this on the spreadsheet. So we start off by saying, on this gift, remember it's the loss in value, what was the value before the gift? 80% shareholding, therefore use the £24 a share value, and that was 1,920,000. After, use the 60% shareholding, and it was £17 a share. So the 60%, 60,000 shares will be worth 1,020,000. Okay, so the transfer of value is 900,000. Now, there'd be 2.5 marks for doing that. So you're already nearly halfway through the marks just by doing that. And that's the easiest bit of it, to be honest, because the more tricky part, I think, is the previous gifts, the pets, the gift into trust, which ones to ignore, which ones to pick up, how to allocate the annual exemptions. So as a minimum, you'd hope to get those 2.5 marks. And I think most people should be able to get that. Okay, annual exemption for 2021 and 1920, they were used by the pet on 1 July 2020. So a basic point that was being tested here was, do you know that when somebody makes a pet, even if it never becomes chargeable, it uses up that year's annual exemption and the preceding year's annual exemption if that hadn't already been used up. Okay. Then the nil rate band is 325,000, and it's used up by transfers in the preceding 7 years. Another key point is you don't count pets at this point because they haven't become chargeable, and they might never become chargeable. You're only looking at chargeable transfers. So the only transfer to take into account is that gift of cash to the trustees of 170,000 on 1 November 2020. That's at line 13 on that spreadsheet. Take off the annual exemptions available and only the 16-17 annual exemption. The previous year's one was used by the pet. So you've got 167,000 of transfer. You've got 320 in the previous 7 years, chargeable transfer, net of the annual exemption. You've got 325,000 of nil rate band. So available nil rate band is 158,000. And so what's chargeable of your 900,000 is there for 742,000, and the rate is 25% because the donor is paying. There's an explanation. Donor is paying. You didn't strictly need that, but I put it in, so a mark for that. So there'll be 6 marks there in my estimation: 2.5, 2.5, and 1. 2.5 for the transfer of value, 2.5 for the using up of the nil rate band up to that point, and 1 mark for working out the tax at the right rate. Okay. Now, I don't think that was the easiest question, but there were some easy bits in that. Okay. So let me just come away from that. So I go back to the required just to pull this together. Okay. Put this up full screen. So deliberately haven't covered the first bit, which was the ethics part. But you see the investment in J Limited, we covered that, and that was 9 marks. And that's by far the most difficult part of this, because you have to consider the position from, is it resident, not resident, if 25 or 30%, if it's profitable or loss-making. Then it was a self-contained part election to exempt the profits of J's overseas permanent establishments, 3 marks, and again a relatively self-contained part on CFC's, 3 marks. 5 marks for the purchase of the investment property, and 6 marks for the proposed gift of the shares. So just to reiterate, it all breaks down into smaller questions, smaller mini questions, and that's the way to view it. Okay, but in this question, section A question, you have to then go to the required, and then you're building up. Where is it? There we are. You're building up, getting more information there as we've been through. Okay, so you need to pick up from this what else you're required to do. And Appendix 1, again, I'm jumping about a wee bit here, which was the information that you need to pick up in that information as it's relevant. Okay, that we've been through. Okay, so my advice is break it down into its parts, think of them as little mini questions, keep to time within those mini questions. So 9 marks is about 16 minutes. I mean, that's tight, I know that. But you want to move on and scoop up the marks from the other sections. And if it's 3 marks or 4 marks or whatever it is, you're looking to make 3 or 4, 5 ideally, maybe 1 more point than the marks. So 3 marks, try and make 4 relevant points, but make them relevant to your answer. Right, okay. So I think that's all I would say on this question. And so I'm going to hand back, because we're in quite good time for some questions before we wrap this up. So I'm going to hand back, stop sharing screen, and hand back to Kritika for the questions and answer session.
Thank you, Roderick. That's been incredibly useful. You've shared so many nuggets, especially just dissecting the past exam paper and doing that active read along with your presentation of the sample answer. I know that as a student, I certainly would have found that really, really useful. So thank you. Now, we're going to turn our attention to the Q&A inbox. And I've sort of mentioned in the introduction that we're not going to be able to answer all your questions, but we'll try and answer as many as we can, particularly those that will be helpful to everyone on this webinar. So if I actually open up with a question that's very topical. So here the question, Roderick, is, are students expected to reference tax measures that are implemented as a result of the current economic crisis and COVID-19 and their responses?
Well, the good news, Kritika, is, and the short answer is no, they're not, okay, because these are temporary measures, and although various governments around the world have implemented tax measures to combat the economic effect, because they're temporary, they won't be examinable. Okay, so you don't have to reference those at all, which is good news.
Brilliant. That's good to know. So if you're wondering whether we need to reference the current situation, the answer, as Roderick just said, is no. So that's fantastic. A couple of more questions coming in. So here we have a student asking about abbreviations. I know you've sort of touched on time management as one of your sort of points and useful nuggets. And so the student here is really just saying, can we use common abbreviations in the exam answer, such as CGT for capital gains tax and IHT for inheritance tax, CT and IT, so on and so forth. So what would we say there, Roderick?
Yes, that's a good question. I would say yes. Now, I'm not an examiner, and I suppose that in a perfect world, everything should be fully written out and explained. But remember what your objective is in this paper, and it is to get a technically correct answer to the question. And if you're technically correct, and it's understandable, and people understand, even the man in the street understands CGT and IHT, or lots of people do, that will be fine. So I would say okay to use abbreviations. I don't think they're going to mark you down for using those kind of abbreviations. well-known, understood abbreviations like that. So I wouldn't. I would focus on getting the technically correct answer down, and I wouldn't worry too much about writing stuff out like that. Fully, just use the abbreviations.
Brill. Okay, sorry, I disconnected there for a second, but I think I'm back. Can you hear me okay, Roderick?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I guess we'll move on to the next question that we've had a student sort of pop in the Q&A chat. So we've got a student here asking about how do we remember all the dates and the information for the relevant tax rules? So do you have any useful tips in terms of remembering things?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much tax, isn't there? And that's the real problem. How do you remember all of the detail? Okay, I would say in your studies, as you're going through the material, try and focus on the core sort of technical points of each area, and try and test yourself, put the material aside once you think you've got it, test yourself and say, could I get these core technical points down? So I think I've got, maybe I can go, can I go to one of these slides here? Maybe,
yes, of course.
Can I bring that up? Is that come up, that slide? Push to audience. I can't see it. Oh yeah, here we are. There we are. Okay. So here's an example. Okay. This is gift relief. So I've just taken that as an example. Gift relief. Capital gain on a gift, including a sale at undervalue, is computed using proceeds equal to market value. For a business asset, the gain can be deferred on a joint claim by the donor by reducing the donee's base cost. If you make a gain in cash terms, that bit of the gain can't be deferred. That's the way I'd try and understand it and get it into your head if you can, because these are the core points. Okay, you've got a capital gain on a gift, market value is what you use, and if it's a business asset, you can defer the gain against the base cost of the donee, the recipient, by making a joint claim. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is try and, on each area, just boil it down to the core points and try and remember those. Now, I'm not trying to say it's not a tall order. There's a huge amount of material in the syllabus, but take, for example, any relief, you should be all over the reliefs for capital gains tax, for example, like that one. But try and boil it down in just to the main points, okay, and focus on those. But in particular, if something can be claimed, like a claim here, then try and know the time limit. Now, here's a quick tip on time limits. There's two. It's either going to be 4 years in the case of personal tax from the end of the tax year, or 4 years from the end of the accounting period for a company, or for the other one is at the anniversary of 31 January after the tax year on the personal tax side, or 2 years from the end of the accounting periods, if the company's accounting period end. If you have to guess for individuals, anniversary of 31 January after the tax year. For companies, 2 years after the end of the accounting period. It's more often that, much more often that, than 4 years from the end of the tax year, or 4 years from the end of the accounting period end for companies. But the two that it is 4 years for is gift relief and rollover relief. So remember those two. But if you have to guess anniversary of 31 January for individuals, the corporate tax equivalent is 2 years from the end of the accounting period. Okay, I hope that answers your question. To try and get these things into, in a nutshell, points, that's the way I would say.
Brilliant. No, that's really, really useful. Thank you for that, Roderick. We've got a few more. So here we've got a student asking, is it okay to write an assumption that you've made from the facts of the question when you don't understand the wording of the question exactly? So I guess it's all about making assumptions based on facts when you don't understand the wording of a question. Do you have any useful points for that particular query?
Yes, I would say, first of all, that shouldn't really happen. I know that doesn't really answer your question. It shouldn't really happen because the examiner will have gone to an enormous amount of trouble to try and make it clear what he's getting at and the facts of the question. So I would say reread just to make sure that you can't pick up what you're not clear about from the question. So reread it and try and see if you've misunderstood something or not read it carefully enough. But if you're still at the position where, yes, I think I do need to make an assumption, then make a reasonable or realistic assumption. So you don't make a sort of ridiculous assumption, like, for example, I'm assuming this company is not resident, so not within the charge to tax at all, and therefore I don't have to say anything. I'll be obviously an extreme example of excuse me, a ridiculous assumption. So make it an assumption that's sensible and relevant to the scenario, and you put your assumption down and then answer on that basis. And hopefully you'll get some credit, assuming you're technically correct in what you answer.
Yeah, okay. Brilliant. No, that sounds sensible. I know you've touched on through the webinar a little bit about time management and really just managing your time well so that you can maximize your chances of scoring that passing grade. And we've had, a couple of questions around sort of time management, one in particular about, sort of the reading and planning time. And here the student's sort of asking 15 minutes doesn't seem like enough for reading and planning. So is it too much to use a third of the allocated time for this? So is there anything further you could perhaps suggest or advise in terms of planning and reading time?
Yeah, I would say the 15 minutes, I would say you want to sort of read through the paper once ideally and scope it out and see which are the easier bits for you and the more difficult bits for you. And in particular, on the more difficult bits, it's tempting to give those more time, but in actual fact, you never give them more time, because if they're difficult bits, you want to have identified that in the 15 minutes pre-exam, pre-reading time, as it were, and you want to say, right, when I get to that, I'll make the best of it, and I'll aim to get a third of the marks. Any tax question or part of a question, there should be a third of the marks are quite easy to get. I'll aim to get, say, something basic but relevant, technically relevant, and get at least a third of the marks, and then maybe I'll get a bit more. I'll give it the time allocated to it, but no more. Okay, so and then I'll move on. Okay, so what you're trying to do in the first 50 minutes is just scope out the question, the paper, I should say, and identify it, read it through once. Because by the time you actually get to the last question, at least you'll have read it, and if there's something in it you think, oh, what's that about? Your subconscious has had a chance to do some work on it. And you might be surprised at what pops into your brain when you get to the last question. But you want to then, after that, get onto the questions and break it down and keep moving through the exam bit by bit, segment by segment, saying what's relevant and correct as far as you can. I can't emphasize this enough. Passing the exam is not about getting it correct. It's about accumulating the marks. It's about accumulating enough marks to pass. It's not about getting it correct. An attitude of I want to get this correct will mean you will overrun on questions. And the examiner's commented, I think, in one of his examiner reports, how that is a real issue. People are obviously taking too long in the first few questions and not enough on the end. They've forgotten their objective, in my opinion. Your objective is to get through the paper. It will feel like you're scrabbling to get the marks. It won't feel satisfactory, but actually moving through the paper and doing what you can do in each bit and keeping it going, keeping it moving, and accumulating the marks is how to pass this. You know, nobody could get it all correct in the time allocated. You know, in the real world, no client would expect you to do this paper and answer all these things in the time allocated. So I would say, yes, use the 50 minutes to scope out the paper and read it through and understand it. But other than that, keep to time question by question. Say what you can say that's relevant, even if it's basic, and correct. One of the things I think students waste a lot of time on is pouring down everything they don't know in an area because they haven't focused in on what the required was. Just focus in on that, cover that, move on. Your answers to the different segments should be quite brief, actually, as hopefully I've shown in my answers to parts of these.
Yeah. That's really useful, and that sort of ties in with something you sort of mentioned a couple of times. You mentioned the word "don't brain dump," and don't just write down everything that you can think of. So that really does, reinforce that point and the importance of quality rather than quantity when it comes to, writing out an answer. So yeah, great advice there. Another question that we've had pop in here, Roderick, is one about, so you sort of went through the December exam question, and it says here, as this December question 1 is presentation of meeting notes, would we be able to use bullet points, or are we advised not to? So what would you say in terms of sort of format and presentation of presenting an answer for a set of meeting notes?
It's a very good question. Here's what I would say as a practical piece of advice from a tutor. I would say the key thing to pass this paper is, this is what the examiner is looking for. I'm quite sure, I'm not an examiner, but this is what he's looking for. He's looking for, have you got technically correct relevant points down? If they're not complete sentences, is he really going to fail you for that? You get, tax is a technical subject. This is a technical paper. If you're getting technically correct marks down, which are relevant, that's absolutely crucial. You get nothing for technically correct marks that are not relevant to the scenario. But if you're getting technically relevant marks down, technically correct and relevant, even if they're in bullet point format, how can you not pass? It would be a travesty if you didn't get marks for those. And I've been a marker, not for this qualification, and I've been an exam writer. And I know what we're all really concerned about as an exam writer, exam marker, is, does this student know the stuff technically? But only relevant points. And I would say, I think, or I'm not a marker for this qualification and I'm not an examiner, but I cannot believe you'd be significantly penalised if it's technically correct and relevant. Let that be your goal. Okay, they do want you to pass, and they will want you to see you putting down technically correct relevant points. So I just don't think you'll be significantly disadvantaged if you use bullet points.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just thinking back to when I was a student, I recall my tutors sort of advising very similarly. So, like you sort of say, as long as the points are technically correct, you're not going to get penalised. There's no negative marking, right, in these exams. So that's a really good point to sort of... Yeah. Precisely. So here's one from a student about the tax rate. So will the June exam tax rates be the same tax rates that we have for the March exams, as it were?
I'm not certain about that, actually. I'm sorry, I'm not certain about that. What point they change over. So I'll have to park that one.
That's okay, not a problem. We'll sort of refer back to that and send out comms as necessary regarding that, not a problem. Moving on to one that we've had from a student about approach. So how would you approach the question that we just went through? In terms of, would you go from requirement A to D, or would you focus on the parts you feel comfortable with? So what would your sort of advice be there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. If you're satisfied that different sections are self-contained sections, you can do them in that way. And the risk is that you've got that wrong, and actually the answer to one bit, a later bit, depends on your analysis of the earlier bit. So that's the slight risk of that. But if, for example, in that question, A, B, C, and D were all self-contained parts, and actually within B, the residency bit was self-contained from the PE election and from the CFC bit. And I would expect that normally to be the case. So I think, generally speaking, yes, you could do it in the way you want it. Certainly the purchase of the investment property and the gift of the shares are completely separate from all the residency stuff. So I think that's fairly clear to most students that these are separate parts. So definitely you could do those if you wanted first. And I would certainly not dissuade you from that, because whatever you're doing to begin with in the exam, if you feel comfortable and good about it and you feel you're making progress, that gets you into a virtuous circle in the exam rather than a vicious circle where you start with something and it descends into a nightmare and you sort of lose the thread of where you are and you lose your confidence, etc. So I would say, yes, there's a lot to be said for assuming you're reasonably confident it's a self-contained area. And I think it's quite clearly A and C and D in that, the knowledge the ethics bit, the purchase of the investment property and the gift of the shares purely well, where then as long as you're satisfied with that, then yes, do that. But keep to time, because there can be a danger in an area you're comfortable with of you overwriting. Remember, look at the mark allocation, and if it's 5 marks, then you're looking for 5 or 6 separate relevant technical points. And once you've got that, move on. So there can be a tendency when you think you're writing good stuff, that when you're writing more, you're continuing to accumulate marks and marks and marks, and at some point you run out of the marks. So keep it more focused maybe than you might think when you're comfortable with an area. But yes, I think you could easily have done, in that question, you could have done A separately from B, separately from C, separately from D. And I would say do that, but watch your time. Keep the time allocation. Okay. So now once the exam starts, time and exam management in that regard is crucial. Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, prioritizing there, as you say, especially with the self-contained questions, seems to be something that students can think about as an exam strategy, and that's a really useful point to sort of take away. Now, just a couple of more before we sort of wrap up. There's a student here who's taking the advanced taxation exam after graduating from university about 8 years ago. So, do we have any tips for learners that may potentially have had a gap between sort of studying tax and now sitting the exam, or having studied it several years ago? So any thoughts or tips that we have there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's quite a long. I suppose it depends how much of it you realise. Sorry, remember, not realise, remember. But I would say the more work you put into it in getting back on top of the material, the better. But when you're going over something and you think, yes, I get that, I remember this, I get that, practice a few questions on it, and assuming that confirms that you have more or less remembered it, move on. Don't spend too much time on stuff that you feel reasonably okay about. Move on to the stuff that's new and different. 8 years ago, some things have changed quite a bit, but other things haven't. So move on to the stuff that has changed a lot, that you or you've completely forgotten. Even it may not have changed, but you've just completely blanked it and completely forgotten it. So focus in on that stuff. Now, I don't know if I can bring up this slide. Does that? Right. So ethical issues, and I would say for ethical issues, read past questions and answers, and I would read them one after the other. I would identify as many questions as you can that have ethics, the ethics part of it, and I'd read the ethics part and then the ethics answer. Read the next question on ethics and then the answer, and so on and so forth. That's a quick way to start getting familiar again with that. On income tax, personal tax computations, employment benefits, and trading losses for the self-employed are very frequently examined areas. NIC, which a lot of students don't like, class 1, 2, and 4. CGT, the capital gains relief. Entrepreneurs relief, it's going to be changing its name, but entrepreneurs relief and gift relief are the two most important. So this is a list of things to focus on. IHT lifetime gifts, we saw that in the last question. Lifetime gifts is the most examined IHT aspect. So I would go through this list and I would say, what of that am I rusty on after 8 years and need to get on top of? So get on top of that as a priority. And then over the page, corporation tax, things to do with groups and capital gains, including rollover relief. Rollover relief is the only capital gains relief for corporation tax. So of all the reliefs, that's the one that's most important to be completely on top of, because it applies for individuals in business and also companies, the only one that applies for companies. And VAT registration is the most important thing that comes up. Now, I'm not saying when I say this, limit yourself down only to those. I'm saying there's a priority list that if you've been out of this area for a while, a few years, that's a place to start, okay? But stuff that you get back in your head reasonably quickly and understand, think, oh yeah, I remember that, got that now. Because lots of stuff in tax doesn't change. Then don't spend too long on that, get onto the more tricky new stuff. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that showing that list is really, really helpful. So hopefully you've got something to take away there. Now, I know we're running out of time, but there is just one that I wanted to ask you about, Roger, because we've had a couple of students asking this. It's to do with attempting section A or section B in the exam first. So we've got a student here saying, is it best to do section B first because there's less information to read? Have you got any sort of points or advice on that front?
Yeah. So I would say use the 15 minutes to begin with to read the whole paper, and your objective is in my opinion, just to identify what's the most straightforward question for me and what's the most difficult question for me. And you start with the most straightforward question, or the one you're happiest with, no matter where it is, and you leave the other question, the one that's the most difficult, to the end. You want to get off on a good footing to this. You want to build your confidence in the exam. And if you leave a question, and nobody will leave a question saying, I absolutely smashed that to themselves. That's ridiculous. But if you leave a question saying, I think that was probably not too bad, you have probably done really well, and you can be confident. You want to get into a virtuous circle where your confidence is building rather than diminishing after the first question. So I would say use the 15 minutes to scope out the whole paper and say, which is the best question for me to start? And that might depend on your experience and just your aptitude and what you thought, which areas of tax you find more straightforward. I find corporation tax more straightforward than other taxes, but I know other students don't, or other people don't. So it's whatever you are most comfortable with is the question to start with. And I would say it doesn't really matter whether it's A or B. Okay, but do keep to time, do break it down. Okay, it's a mark accumulation exercise. This is not an exercise in getting it all correct. Okay, and the students who can't leave a question after the allotted time have forgotten that. They are trying to get a perfect answer. Okay, and it's an admirable quality in the real world, but in the exam, all you're bothered about is accumulating the marks. So keep moving through the exam. Let that be your mantra. Keep moving through your exam. But start with the easiest question for you, one you're most comfortable with.
That's a great note to end on. Keep moving, just keep going. That will see you through with the passing grade. Brilliant. Big thank you to Roderick and the team behind the scenes, and a massive thank you to you for your participation. Goodbye and good luck for your forthcoming exam.
Goodbye. Good luck.